How do you define rhetoric and composition pedagogy? Because that is such a broad term. And to make this big claim that digital ethos is just not dealt with in rhetoric and composition pedagogy, to me that's a big gap in your thesis. So could you just talk about that a little bit?
I agree that it's a broad claim, and I wish that I had had the space to really explore that further. Composition and rhetoric, or rhetoric and composition pedagogy, is my impression of it is largely based on my teaching experience and the textbooks that we used in our class, as well as the other textbooks and the other research that I've done on this issue. And what I found was that the majority of the approaches were still dealing with those kind of older, entrenched concepts. I think that, for me, I view composition as including rhetoric as a basic component. I realize that that is not necessarily always the case. There are vastly different approaches. But for me, and the way that I was trained, rhetoric is an integral component. And so I have a hard time separating those two. So when I say rhetoric and composition pedagogy, to me that's essentially what they are, is very integral components to each other.
But what does that mean? What is rhetoric and composition pedagogy?
If I was to define it, I would say that it is writing techniques that are taught based in the classical Greek concepts of rhetoric. You can see your face already. And teaching students to employ those in their own texts.
Yeah, I'm coming from the teacher ed department, but I just want to say I really enjoyed it. And once I got into looking at the definitions and reading your definitions and explanations, I really enjoyed it. And I took away it's digital literacy. And I know way back when I was doing work with media literacy, so just simplistically, I mean, you came up with this heuristic, correct? I mean, this is your strategy?
Correct.
Because I definitely can see its place in other content areas, but I guess my question is, so say I'm in teacher education, and one of the struggles I have, I know in the English department you use MLA, but we use APA. I struggle with even getting my students to track where they're finding this information and go and look beyond. And you talked about using traditional methods of looking at the credibility. So I think I want to explore that a little bit more and ask you, can you see it, how would you see this process being adapted in another content area? We also have an IT program within the teacher ed department, but I want this in that program as well because I think it's a really important part. And your example was great. That just put it all together, the Coney example, and just the 24 sites and things like that. But I want to see if you said that you mentioned that you could see this being used or adapting it to different situations. Can you give an example of where you might see that?
As I said, I envisioned it as working in a first-year composition class. The ways that is structured here is that there are 3 primary papers that are done. I could see this being used, and I will get to the other genre here in a minute, but I could see this being used as one of the major papers in a course like that because of the opportunities for analysis that it provides. It could be very short examples where you give students 2 sites and say make connections between them and intertextual relationships and then write an analysis of it. It could be something like the 24 links that I demonstrated. But I think that a large part of why this could be effective is the map that's created that allows students to visualize the network and the connections. I tutor right now in the GSSC, and we see education majors, we see nursing majors who also have a very hard time making connections and tracking their sources. So I can see this definitely working. I think this would also work in terms of writing a lit review, where you're essentially gathering these sources, making connections between them. We're encouraged to talk to, when we're doing a lit review, look at how sources are in conversation with each other. This demonstrates that very well, I think.
I know I've been living this project with you for the last few months, but I reread it again last night.
You shouldn't have any questions left.
I actually, believe it or not, I have more. So I'm not really sure how to prioritize, but I guess one of the ones that I'd like to hear you talk about with us, and it's kind of multifaceted, so just bear with me, I'll try to articulate it in the best way I can. But I'm particularly interested in this project, and you mentioned it at the end of your presentation, the tension between kind of, as you referred to it, entrenched conceptions of ethos that have kind of been with us for the 2,500 plus years of the Western rhetorical tradition, and what we're seeing now with new media, right, and digital media in particular. And so it's interesting to me whenever you analyze the fourth step of your heuristic, and you analyze those relationships, the intertextual relationships, and how that affects the ethos of the focal text. To me, it's still very Aristotelian in nature, because if you look at the corroborating information or the informing information, well, that speaks to what Aristotle would refer to as phronesis, right, which is the intelligence of the speaker. And then the contradicting information, it balanced out the bias that you noticed in the original text, which is kind of refers to what Aristotle would call arete, or virtue, right, seeking kind of a middle balance path between two options. And so that leads me to kind of wonder, again, I'm sorry if this is kind of a muddled question, it's multifaceted, but like, one, it makes me wonder if we can ever get outside of classical conceptions of ethos. Two, it makes me wonder, is it even necessary for us to get outside of those conceptions, or is the goal something else? And if it is something else, what might that goal be? And then thirdly, if in the end, if we're returning to the focal text and we can still see Aristotelian concepts at work here, and really with the meltdown that the founder had, we can even see kind of Roman concepts too of virtuous behavior. What is then different about this? What is this adding to our understanding of ethos? So I'm sorry that's a very multifaceted.
I will try to address all of these.
By the way, I want to say that I think it speaks well to your argument and to your project that it can evoke that kind of response. So.
I think what you're asking is so important, because that's that tendency we have to go, oh, kids today, as though there were never problems before. And we all know Plato sat around going, kids today, they just don't understand. And if they only would do X and X. And so I think there is that tendency to say, if only they would do this, when in fact this has always been an ongoing struggle. And this concept of ethos is one from Aristotle on, we've struggled with.
I would say rather maybe than material differences between classical conceptions and my conception, there are rather significant similarities. And I say that because Christy Fleckenstein, as I talked about, argues that classical Greek rhetoric and current digital environments have much in common in the sense that they are contextually constructed. And that is what I think is missing from current conversations, or from recent conversations. I think the conversations are starting to incorporate those elements. But I think that's what's been missing, and partly because I think the technology makes that much easier to have that discussion than print texts do. So I think that it actually maybe is a throwback, or maybe not reconceptualizing, but revisiting those theories and applying them to this new technology, and in an alternative way than's currently being discussed. I don't think that this is, revolutionary and has never been discussed, and I agree that these have always been problems. And I don't want to present this as, oh, I've solved all these, because I've read research that has taken that approach, and I don't think that that's true. But I do think that this kind of harkens back to those concepts, the contextual nature of them, and incorporating all of those elements, and not just looking at one single element or one single text. Because the rhetorical environment, according to Fleckenstein, involves so much more than that.
So then recognize, just so I'm clear, so recognizing the contextual characteristics, if you will, of ethos. That's what you're saying.
Not only recognizing them, but employing them. I mean, looking at the ways that actually impacts ethos. It isn't just a contextual thing. It is created because of its context. And that, I think, is part of what I'm arguing for. So I don't think we need to abandon those concepts. I mean, I think that those are, as you said, they're still present. And I think that they essentially are what we know of as ethos. But I think alternative approaches to them are a good thing.
Let's talk about Fleckenstein. Fleckenstein or Steen?
I always called her Fleckenstein, and she never corrected me. So.
Okay. Well, I made it wrong.
I don't know. I don't know. But specifically the article, the Who's Writing article, and her definition of ethos. I want to talk a little bit about, on my page, that idea of, and this is in some ways maybe dragging out Scott's very on point question, but this idea of those things that are created for a scholarly audience and those things that are created for public consumption. And so even you even did this yourself, where you made the reference to Chris Blattman, and instead of letting him live in his sort of digital world, in his relationship, his hypertextual relationship with all these other texts, you pointed out Yale professor, right? So you constructed his ethos in this very traditional sort of way immediately for us. You do it in your thesis too. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think it's impossible. I would be loath to encourage students to read and consume from the internet without ever considering those classical modes of ethos. That's my opinion. But I want to talk about specifically why those texts are created, because you do a really interesting thing, right? Because you use the article, specifically who's writing, where she connects Aristotelian practices to digital ethos, right? I mean, she specifically does that. But you also use Barth, right, who dies in 1980, who writes all these wonderful things that have nothing to do with a modern conception of hypertextuality, intertextuality, networking. Also not surprising, some of the blue stockings in 200 years ago, British blue stockings, the women who were writing things and referring to themselves as a network, right, as they're writing letters. And that's technology to them, right, because they're sharing information in their world very, very quickly because they're writing a letter, they're dropping it in this magical place, and it's appearing someplace else, maybe, 3 weeks later, but it's still happening, and that's just radical. Now it's 3 seconds, or less than that. So I wonder, in terms of this modern conception of hypertextuality, if you believe what Fleckenstein argues about ethos being this very complex construction of not just the author, but of the author's audience, of all the other texts that interrelate. I mean, these are things we know as scholars already. I mean, I think we could argue that you could pick up the same thing, take the word digital out of it, and talk about just the construction of scholarly texts and the way they interact. And we always hope our graduate students are looking at the sources of the sources they're citing, and then going back and, they start down that rabbit hole of scholarship, right? But I wonder then how, if you believe Fleckenstein's definition about ethos being this very complex construction, how does that work in this sort of heuristic where all of these pieces are connected and it is impossible to argue what any given audience might look like, who that given audience would be? How is ethos ever really constructed in that particular model when every single one of those individual pieces might have a super addressee, sort of that ideal audience in mind, and yet their real audience is something very different, and it's very different from the piece that's linked next to them, to this other, to this, So are these a little bit in conflict? Fleckenstein's argument about what the definition of ethos even should be, that you use very heavily to define your own definition of digital ethos, and then the actual heuristic you create, how would you navigate that, if that is true? I mean, you can answer that piece first, but then how would you navigate that in a classroom as you're walking students through this sort of assignment?
I don't have a hard and fast answer to that because I don't think there is one, honestly. I do agree with Christy Fleckenstein's definition of ethos, and that it is contextual and that all of those elements contribute. And I think that complicates greatly the process of analyzing ethos. The maps that I put up for the network of these texts, they actually all have arrows shooting off of the other ones too. I mean, indefinitely, it could keep going. We cannot, however, analyze the ethos of the internet in a composition class. That would be very difficult to do.
Students try occasionally, right?
Yeah, they do. They certainly do. And so I think part of this is emphasizing that this is only part of the network, that it goes on, that every text you encounter is connected to every other text. There are theorists, White was one of them, Jeff White, and I think Bolter, who say that the internet is a text, that by itself it is a text. So the network is just intended to help them conceptualize a part of it, and I think that needs to be emphasized, that it is not the whole internet. It is not every audience. It is only really the audiences that we can address through these texts, that we can look at through these texts. And again, we're speculating on what those audiences are based on classical kind of signs of what those might be. I also think it complicates that scholarly popular breakup. You mentioned that I said that Blattman is a Yale professor. The reason why I put that in there is because it was quoted in on Coney 2012. And originally my discussion of Blattman emphasized that he was a Yale professor, and I had to take that out because it was focusing on credentials. But I thought it was interesting that on Coney 2012 emphasizes that part, because clearly they saw it as being supporting
So then why would you remove it? Why would you remove it? Why would you not just embrace?
Well, because I basically didn't have the time or the space to really explore that, but that's actually one area I'm really interested in, is the separation between scholarly and popular, and whether that gap is shrinking now and what that means, because when we're trying to get students to use sources in class, they struggle with what scholarly even is, partly because they've never been exposed to it, and partly they just don't know the differences, and they don't understand why we can't use popular sources. So one of the reasons why I also chose this on Coney 2012 article is because it's a popular source. But it is very well researched, and it has a lot of background on this information.
But you know that only because you apply very traditional means of determining ethos, right?
But I think that a student could see that by looking at the breadth of information that's provided and the types of information and how those relationships work with the text. So if all of the texts are corroborating, because it's possible you could apply this heuristic and come up with very different results. Maybe all of the links are corroborating links. I think that opens the class for a discussion on what does this mean if everybody that they link agrees with them? Do you think that there is nobody out there that disagrees? So I think you can have that discussion and maybe work on making connections between popular and scholarly. The other reason I used that source, originally what I wanted to do was use a popular source and a scholarly source. I couldn't find any scholarly sources that included exterior links.
Would you consider Blattman's article, his blog post, would that not be a scholarly article? Written
Not
by
in
a scholar?
Not in terms of being published in a scholarly journal, which is kind of what I was hoping to find. But
so
yes,
you would only consider it scholarly if it appears in a scholarly?
No, not me personally. I'm just saying in terms of how we usually conceptualize. Yeah, that's what I was hoping to do, is a traditional scholarly published article, and then this popular article. But I didn't get the chance to do this in my thesis, but if I were to expand this, that's one thing that I would like to look at, is making an argument that maybe that gap is shrinking and what that might mean.
Now you can pull up, and Kevin can talk to this, but you can pull up a scholarly article and see how many citations of this article have happened. You can click on links. Scholarly articles, really current scholarly articles are very digitized and very hyperlinked in lots of ways. I wonder, could you play devil's advocate? Because I think we have to, as teachers, regardless of what content area we're talking about, we have to think about the potential pitfalls and problems, and the most well thought out projects and lesson plans still tend to blow up in our faces if we're not careful. So I just wonder, can you just talk about this for a second? How could this kind of heuristic, this kind of project in a classroom further convolute? You already admitted students have so much trouble distinguishing between that which is created for the sort of popular consumption and those things that we consider in this traditional way scholarly, though we can argue what that looks like anymore. Something like this, where you're taking character and traditional ideas of credibility out of it and asking them to just look at the way the texts relate and how that creates ethos outside of the author himself or herself, right? Is that going to further convolute the way we deal with students? Talk about that. Pretend that it does, and how do you address that? How could you still use a project like this in a classroom and not muddy the waters any further? Not veer us off of that sort of programmatic goal of get students to sort of, inform their discourse through a more, informed means, right?
I don't know that this heuristic would work in a classroom in the way that we currently teach, because we do emphasize character and credibility, and it could muddy the waters if we taught both. But what I do think is that this demonstrates kind of a different aspect. So, and one of the problems that I could see occurring is if you are just trying to look at one single text. This is not designed for that. This is designed to look at a network of texts, specifically in digital environments, because I'm arguing partly that you can't separate a text. But if a student wanted to say, does this text have good ethos. I don't want to look at any other text, I just want to know about this. I think that could be a problem. I think that could be confusing to them. Why do I have to go look at 20 other articles to figure out what the ethos is here? But my hope is, again, providing that visual element kind of alleviates that and demonstrates that you can't separate the text. So that's one way I could see that that could confuse people. I think also students might wonder, you know, what's the point of credibility then? What's the point of or character? What's the point of the author's credentials?
Put something
Why
out there
does it
on
matter
YouTube,
if-
get a million
yeah.
hits.
I wrote an informed paper and I put it up there. What does it matter that I don't have a PhD? So I think that could be a very confusing discussion and one that's probably worth having. But I think it would be a different discussion than we've been having about character and credentials. I think personally that they will be less important in the digital environment in the network. Because as I said, it's sort of distributed across the network. And so the Yale professor's comments are equated with somebody who wrote a blog called something like "I like peanut butter sandwiches" or something. I mean, you know, and those get equated and they kind of cancel each other out. So I don't know what my response to that would be, but I could see that as a problem.
I still want to do it.
Well, and that's actually I'm dying to do this in a class.
I think that's where I was going to, my first question about the practical applications of it all. And even when I was going through it, you made me think about some things, you know, even you talked a little bit about like the start of having a browser that had a graphical interface. And I was thinking, that's only 20 years ago, and I know that really well when that happened, which is kind of scary. But anyway, I mean, I too, when I was reading it, I was like, okay, I understand that. I mean, you put a lot of the great, you know, terms and the explanations, but it was, okay, I know this, okay, I understand all this. So I too want to, I think, again, hitting from a practical point, but what do you want to end up doing with this in the future? I would love it if you taught it in class. I mean, that would be great, but I think too, you have to look at it, you still have to maybe use some of the constructions, you're looking at the credibility and the character, those kinds of things, but how will this differ? You know, I guess I also want to see, like, where do you see a Wikipedia fitting in? I mean, do you also want to have students construct this? I think that would be a great process. I'm going through your 4 steps of your heuristic again, having them actually create something, and maybe that would also tie in, again, you know, your again, what you want them to gain out of this. I mean, looking at it a little bit more in depth. I mean, not only the sources, but again, the content, credibility and validity and those kinds of things. But what are your next steps? I mean, what do you want to, what will you do with this?
Well, right now I'm not teaching.
Okay.
But if I were to teach, what I would like to do is apply this. And if I were to apply it, what I would do is make it a major project, basically a section of a class. I think you could use this in small bits, but I think it would be most effective if students worked with this over a long period of time. And so what that would give them the opportunity to do is explore all the texts in the network. Each of them could be an analysis that they do, a blog post where they only look at a text and look at the information and make connections. You could do, I think you could do so many small little assignments like that. And then ultimately what I would hope to have them do is maybe revise as they go and ultimately have a larger analysis where they look at the whole network and talk about, sort of as I did, the ethos of the focal text or the network, but discuss all of the texts and how they all work. And I think a key to that is having them construct it. I think if you presented them with that, they would understand it much less than, I mean, obviously whenever we do something, we understand it better than if we just see it. And so I think that's part of it, is having the students construct that so that they understand the connections, that you cannot escape the connections because of the hyperlinks. They don't go away. Even if you don't click on them, they're still there. If you don't click on them, the gap is never filled, essentially. So that's another part of it that kind of helps them understand that you have to fill that gap in order to understand the text.
Right. When you, just out of curiosity, when you approached that with the CONU project and you asked those students who had already donated money, I mean, was there an understanding? And I'm really glad you gave that explanation of why you were interested in this topic, because I was like, how is she interested in this topic as well? But it was just, did they have an understanding of that? I mean, were they like, wow, I never even thought about that? I mean, do you see that as a glaring
It actually
issue?
started a very interesting conversation, because it started with, oh, no, I didn't know that, because one of the facts that was kind of thrown around is that only 30% of Invisible Children's funding actually goes to child soldiers. The rest of it goes to their travel, their filmmaking, all that kind of stuff. Right. They were shocked by that statistic. They weren't aware of it because they hadn't done any research. And some of them were, oh my gosh, I didn't know that. But then the discussion became, well, I still think that it's a good organization and I still want to donate to it. So it wasn't necessarily trying to get them to change their minds, but trying to make them understand that it didn't exist by itself, that there was commentary about it, that the Invisible Children website has things to say about it, that the financial statement, is relevant, and having them make connections beyond the video. That was really my goal. And I think that the conversation started them on that, because one girl I think said that from now on, before I donate, I will look at that information, which I hope was communicated to them.
And just on another point too, so say with Wikipedia, and you mentioned, so not, and I don't know what everyone else does, but do allow them to use Wikipedia. I mean, I don't as a source, but so how do you get around that? I mean, given what you've just talked about.
We don't have them use Wikipedia, and that's one of the reasons I thought this was an interesting article, because a lot of the articles in this network reference to Wikipedia.
Right.
So that tells me, and some other research that I've read tells me, that Wikipedia is becoming a more accepted site, not necessarily in scholarly resources, but publicly it's becoming much more accepted. I think that a discussion needs to be had about what a wiki is and the nature of a wiki, and that it can change constantly. I mean, a good example is Sarah Palin and her comment about Paul Revere, I think, where she completely got the story wrong, and somebody updated Wikipedia to reflect her version of it. And so, I mean, I've used that. That's a good example. I've used that example before in class to demonstrate this is why you can't use it, because I could go in right now and change the U.S. page to say that Barney is our president, whoever you want to say. So I think that discussion needs to be had. I don't necessarily think that we should discount Wikipedia as being useful. I personally use it when I want just facts about a subject right off, and then I will go do additional research. And one thing that students can do is use those sites that are the sources at the bottom to kind of do additional research. So I don't think it should be discounted, but I think discussion should be had about it.
Too, and I've had exactly that discussion. Why didn't cite this? So, thank you.
Don't you think, though, in a really practical way, one of the reasons your heuristic is so successful, I mean, and so interesting too, is because your focal text is such a good one. I mean, like this is what we do. And my own experience from K-12 says that when you're creating models for your students, you pick the ideal thing, because they're going to struggle more. So yours has to be really great. Well, yours is really great. What do you do when a student comes into your class in this really practical way? You're doing this particular project, and their focal text they choose either this, or you have to choose them. You have to give them a list to pick from or something, right? Which kind of defeats the purpose. Is a Gangnam Style YouTube video, right? What do you do? I mean, how do you direct students to that initial focal text? This has so much meaning for us politically. It probably has meaning for us just because we're civically engaged in a very different way than our students might be. What do you do when they don't pick a good focal text? How do you redirect? How do you help them? And do you somehow hurt your own ethos by doing that?
I'd probably start by having the same discussion I had with students doing rhetorical analysis, which was, why do you think that this would be a good text? And then when they can't come up with anything, you have that discussion about, maybe you want to rethink your choice. For instance, a YouTube video may not be the best choice because the comments might have hypertext links, but that's really what you're looking for, is the links. However, you could do a network of videos, and that might be interesting.
There's a visual component here.
Yeah,
that would
so
be a neat next paper, right?
So that could be a whole other way to approach it. But and I said that ideally this text would have hyperlinks. I think you could do this with a text that doesn't have hyperlinks. It would just be it would be much more difficult in that you'd have to kind of backwards trace which text link that text. So that's what I would tell students they would probably need to do, is work backwards from there and figure out which texts are likely to include it within their network. You basically have to construct the network. Yes, it is an ideal text. Again, a rhetorical choice. And it also has an enormous amount of links. That's an unusual amount of links. And it demonstrated 3 very clear relationships. That may not always be the case. But like I said, I think that could open up discussions about what does this mean that all of the texts have the same relationship? Does this help them? Does this hurt them? But I would probably redirect some of them to more applicable sites that would demonstrate this.
Yeah, but your 3 relationships are a really good starting point, though, I think, in looking at the focal text and saying, do these all, have a contrasting element to them and so on, so.
Definitely, and like I said, they could fall under different relationships, and that's another discussion that could be had. But for me, these were the ones that stood out the most.
Have you seen the? You may have if you haven't, but there was a letter that a professor wrote just this week as he's crossing picket lines to go to. It wasn't a letter; it was an email. He sends an email to his 800 students. He's a math professor, and it basically says, "I'm going to show up to class tomorrow." Which means I'm crossing a picket line to do that, but let me explain to you why I'm doing it. It's not because I don't believe in what my colleagues are fighting for, because I do, but what I believe in more is the value of your education. The thing went viral in like minutes. Students, so we make these assumptions that our students don't see these connections. Students put this email out for the world, and it instantly got hyperlinked all over the place, including the Chronicle of Higher Education, right? What happens when something isn't intended to be intertextual and it suddenly becomes intertextual? How does that change the digital ethos of that piece?
That is actually what started this whole thing, is the meltdown that Jason Russell had, the founder of Invisible Children.
That's supposed to be private, right?
Oh yeah. I mean, who wants that splashed all over the internet? But now you cannot do a Google search for Coney 2012 without pulling that up. And that's really what originally started this, and originally I was kind of focusing on authorship, but what does that mean? You can't escape the fact that these are now connected on Google. Every time somebody goes looking for Invisible Children, they're going to pull up naked pictures of Jason Russell. And he's now done damage control. He went on the talk show circuit and talked about it, and they did the best that they could. But if I don't know about those and I go looking for this is what I find, naked pictures of Jason Russell. So that's what I think is also relevant here, is that it doesn't matter whether it's intentional. So part of it isn't necessarily a rhetorical choice that the author makes, it's the nature of the hypertextual environment that connects them.
Sort of supports your initial claim about Fleckenstein's argument about what ethos even is. I think I've said her name different every time. Right? But, that idea that it's all connected, audience has as much to do.
Because, I think that's much harder to do in the print world, is connect text that you don't intend to be connected, but it's so easy here. And it's also a good conversation to have with students about, what the pictures on Facebook get connected to.
Yes.
I read a random thing yesterday that was a discussion of The Walking Dead. It was that last episode the other night. And the showrunner was quoted as saying, somebody said, well, what does this mean, blah, blah, blah. And he said, I don't know what it means. He said, meaning now is made, I'm no longer the author. Once it's out there, everyone is the author, right? Everyone decides. The audience, however broad that is, now decides what that meaning is and what that can be. And I thought that was really interesting. Just about a random TV show, but I think that speaks to what you're saying.
It's sort of an interesting take on collaborative authorship. It's not necessarily that everybody is writing something, although in the sense of the network, it is collaborative authorship, but a single author's writing gets associated with everything else, and so a single author becomes less important. And then the reader takes different paths through the network and makes up entirely different meanings based on the text that they encountered. That was actually one of the things that I also would like to adapt with the heuristic, is have students trace the path that they take through the network. And maybe different students take different paths and come up with entirely different meanings.
Yeah, you could probably give them all Coney 2012 and still create very different networks.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think any of them would be exactly the same.
Because we didn't even talk about social media and Facebook and things like that. But, even in the case of that professor's email, every time a student put it someplace and reposted it, they put their own little spin on it by contextualizing it, right? Creating their own ethos, their own digital ethos based on their audience, on their Facebook page, that then read through their lens that email, right? And then someone else picks it up and interprets that interpretation and so every time we share and repost and
Absolutely.
things like that. So.
Even if you had them do their own Google search and see who they're linked into, even using
Yeah.
LinkedIn, it's just
And that's
amazing.
another aspect I think would be interesting to
Yeah.
explore is this kind of with the
Yeah, I
concept of
agree.
search engines is
Yeah,
what
and
that
also
does as well.
The visual component of that too is really.
We're going to have a whole group of students. I mean, we do now, but it's certainly going to be true in the next 10 years, who all are going to come to us as freshmen with a very distinct digital footprint,
Yeah.
because they'll have had Facebook accounts, since they were 10, 11, 12, 13. Facebook says you have to be or whatever, right? But they have a digital impact already, whether they know it or not. So just a search of their own name that's very different than what we would deal with students today. And I think probably even half our students today would search their own name and find
I
weird
think you can even
connections.
do maybe use
Yeah.
this heuristic in terms of a personal search of students.
Yeah,
And you
I
could
thought of that
explore
too.
In terms of
Just a
ethos,
search.
that'd be
Yeah.
fascinating.
and look
Yeah,
at
we're-
their ethos.
One aspect of this project that you hint at, but obviously in terms of, like you said, space constraints, and you have to finish your thesis at some point, right?
A good thesis is a done thesis.
Yes, exactly. But I am interested in the production aspect of it. I'm not going to ask that question just in the interest of time and in the interest of allowing our audience to ask questions if they'd like. But Dr. Cheko, you mentioned like having students create something.
Yeah.
So in addition to this because rhetoric in the rhetorical tradition, it's about analysis and production. And you didn't mention it in your presentation, but in your thesis you mentioned the rhetorical canon. And so I think that in terms of future directions, one, teach this, write an article about it, and submit it to composition studies. Two, I think looking at production and how might the heuristic work not just in terms of analysis, but in terms of production. And how might invention, arrangement, style, memory, delivery, how might those 5 canons look in the context of this heuristic that you've created? Okay. That said, I'll give you a less complicated question than the first one. If you could do this process all over again, what would you do differently?
I probably would have picked an article with fewer links. It was really hard. It was less hard to talk about it, but it was very hard to write about them in a way that, because we have a linear structure to the thesis, and it was really hard to talk about them in a linear way. So that complicated it. And then, like I said, I would have probably included other elements like search engines. I would love to explore that. I also would love to trace the path through and see if that actually has an impact on the meaning as well, if that's kind of a different kind of intertextual relationship. Essentially, I would expand it, I think, maybe a dissertation is where I need to take it.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Because I think there's so many other things about this that can be explored in much more detail.
It is funny that it's this very traditional delivery that you had for a project that was very non-traditional in terms of the way you were thinking pedagogically.
And it was very hard to adapt it.
But what's funny too is that your thesis was sort of hyperlinked, right? Whether you knew it or not, because I read it the very first time on October 30th or something, right around Halloween, right, from my iPad. In a program where if I encountered words or references, I could look up like that. You didn't hyperlink them.
I did hyperlink all of
You
these
did
sites.
hyperlink. No, but I'm saying even
Yeah.
things you didn't intend to hyperlink, I could like I linked, I networked, I as a reader created
Right.
a new context.
I found
for
myself
them.
looking up that Comey stuff too. That's okay. So then,
Well, essentially, this thesis becomes a part of that network.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, in a very traditional.
Yeah, in a traditional, in a paper form. Well, not always.
But then someone will still link from
Yeah.
it as soon as it goes on ProQuest, right?
Yeah, that's exactly
Yeah.
what I was going to say, because this will go online.
And if the links are active, then it is part.